And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thank you so much for joining us once again with a brand new guest, and that is Calum Miller. Calum, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. And of course, I was at the March for Life in the UK, which kind of spurred my thinking. And you're a name that I've seen in many different areas, but actually being at that event with you emceeing it. So I want to get your thoughts on that, the UK pro-life movement, your background, all of that. But people can find you at Dr. Calum Miller on X, on Twitter, and of course, calumsblog.com is your blog. All the links will be in the description, whether people are watching or listening. Everything is there, so make sure and make use of those links. But Calum, your background, doctor, you're involved, very involved in the pro-life movement. Maybe I could just step back a little bit and ask you to introduce yourself to our viewers before we get into the actual issue at hand.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a medical doctor, and I actually became pro-life while I was at medical school. So I grew up, like most of the UK, just being pro-choice, or at least most of Great Britain, at least. And I think, it was being at medical school, seeing the reality of life in the womb, seeing the reality of abortion and its impact on the woman as well as the child, that convinced me to be pro-life. So I still work as a doctor. I'm a researcher as well on the topic of abortion and various other bits and pieces. But that's from an ethical perspective, medical, legal, whatever it might be. So I try to look at it from every angle and publish on that. And so I've done quite a bit of academic work on the topic as well. And then I do a lot of work just speaking and writing about this as well. So yeah, I didn't expect to end up here when I started medical school, but that's what I've ended up doing because I think it's one of the most important things that can be spoken about. So here I am.
Maybe ask you what actually changed your mind. I want to delve into that, your background and what can lead you to that. But what kind of led up to that? Because most people, I guess, shrug their shoulders and they think, if it's people's choice and you want to do this or that, people don't really think about it in the UK, I don't think, as much as intentionally as maybe in the US, where it is two kind of blocks on each side and you have a heated, even sometimes constructive argument. In the UK, it just seems to be just kind of shrug your shoulders. So what persuaded you, what led you as you were studying as a doctor to the position that actually life in the womb matters?
Yeah, it was a number of things, really. I think being a doctor, you have to think about it at least a little bit. That's not to say most doctors think about it much and have a well-formed view on it, but at least in my case, it was something that came up in medical school, and so that sort of provoked me a bit more into thinking about what I thought about it. And then also, reading about it, it was very much academic arguments, thinking through the idea of human rights and equality that convinced me. I thought if humans are equal, and they have equal rights, then that has to include every human. And therefore, the main question in abortion is this a human being? And I knew from medical school that it was. And therefore, for me, it was very simple that if this is a human being, as science teaches, and if every human being is equal, as most of us claim to believe, then it just follows really logically that we should be pro-life and protects the child in the womb just as much as anyone else. And so that was a big part of it. I think, part of what brought it up, you're right, is globalization, which normally makes people, normally it's sort of very progressive Western values going to other parts of the world and making them more liberal. In my case, I think globalization took me the other direction to a more traditional view because, I grew up in a very sort of insular progressive country. And it was actually exposure to the fact that most people around the world don't agree with this, and most of them are pro-life, that was part of the thing that got me to reconsider in the first place. So yeah, it was a mix of a whole bunch of things, experience, looking at the arguments, but at its core, it was really that conviction about human equality, human rights, and seeing that if we really believe in them, then they have to apply to everyone and not just the people that it's convenient for.
Now, there are two approaches, and on the March for Life, you have a strongly Christian approach. in that the understanding the Bible is that we are made in the image of God, and therefore everyone has value, no matter where they are, no matter who they are. Everyone is equal and has value. But you've also got, as you pointed out, an ethical argument, a philosophical argument, which is a completely different take on it. What about you as a Christian then? How did that affect your approach to this idea?
Yeah, it wasn't actually a huge part of what convinced me, because I had Christian convictions before I became pro-life, and I thought that was compatible. And later on, I realized Christianity does have a clear position on it, but it was really the arguments about science and philosophy that convinced me primarily. And I think one of the striking things in that sense is that the Bible doesn't actually say when life begins exactly. It talks about conception a little bit, and it clearly respects that there is a life before birth, and so at least at some point before birth the life begins. But of course they hadn't discovered fertilization when the Bible was written. And so when people say you only believe human rights begin at, or life begins at fertilization because the Bible says so, or because of your religion, it's actually the opposite. The Bible doesn't mention fertilization. No one in religion mentioned fertilization until it was discovered scientifically. And it was because of that scientific discovery that Christians said, oh, okay, so we knew that life was valuable from the beginning because the Bible teaches that life is valuable from the beginning, but we didn't know when the beginning was. But now that science has shown us when the beginning is at fertilization, the Christian position, informed by science, tells us that life begins at fertilization and should be protected from then. And so I think clearly, I think if you believe in Christianity and you believe in science, then there's no way to sort of support abortion. But in terms of that claim about when life begins, I think that's ultimately a scientific claim, not a religious one. And so anyone can agree with it. And if for some other reason, say you're not religious, you just believe that all human beings are equal and should be protected regardless, if you believe that and you believe in science, you should also be pro-life. So religion certainly supports the pro-life position in many cases, but it's not needed for it. And so in my own journey, it was not really connected to religion. It was only later that I sort of united them in that sense.
Okay, let me see where I go in this, because I want to pick up. Those are two aspects, I think, and it's interesting your view of being a Christian and yet not necessarily being pro-life. I mean, to me, it's a red line as a Christian that actually we speak up, as Proverbs says, for the voiceless, and who has no voice more than the unborn. Literally, they're not able to speak. And therefore it is up to us to speak up for them. So for me, even that Proverbs is enough to actually step up. And if no one comes and says, that's not life because of X, Y, and Z, if there's no argument for that side, then surely the flip side has to be that you speak up for that. And I've talked to, I'm grew up Baptist, now in Pentecostal church, but talked to a lot of C of E vicars who struggle with this and privately have a view, but publicly seem unable to speak. And it seems to be a fear of what man may say as opposed to a fear of God. I mean, what have your conversations been like with different Christian leaders on actually speaking up on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think your experience is unusual. I say, especially as someone who goes to an Anglican church, I think every Anglican is humiliated by the quality of our leadership. I think, especially at present, that's not about my church. My church leaders are great, but I think
I'm not tying you to Welby in any way, so don't worry.
I think everyone knows at this point that Welby's a bit of a clown, and no one really thinks he has much courage or credibility. And so certainly we don't expect anything remotely controversial or that might upset the sort of powers that be from Anglican leaders. But it's not only an Anglican problem. The only time I've ever heard abortion preached about in a church, as someone who has been going to church most of my life, was I only heard it once, and that was when I was giving a sermon, and that was I was invited by a very bold pastor because he wanted it to be preached on, and that's the only time I've ever heard it preached on in a UK church. And so this is a huge problem across denominations, and I think ultimately there's a vicious circle because people will not know how to speak about abortion in a winsome way, so they don't speak about it. And therefore, the next generation or the people in the congregations don't know what to think about it. And then if they don't know what to think about it, they're even less likely to speak about it in future. And that just sort of reinforces itself. And so I meet the Christian position on this is about as clear as anything could be. It's like absolutely clear. The evidence from church history and from the Bible for the pro-life view is as good or better than the evidence for the Trinity, which is like a core foundational Christian doctrine. And yet I meet a lot of Christians, even otherwise orthodox kind of Bible-believing Christians, who just don't know what to think about this issue. And that is because of this reinforced silence on the issue. And so I would say that in some cases it is just cowardice. In many cases it's just cowardice. But in many cases it's because the church leader maybe might want to speak about this, but genuinely has never seen it spoken about in a way that is convincing and full of grace, and full of compassion and, winsomeness. And I think in that situation, at the very least, our job is to present to those pastors and church leaders a way of communicating this message that is winsome, that does make sense, that is compassionate and full of grace and the gospel. And so, I think, that once we've sort of equipped church leaders with that, then I think we will see which church leaders have a sort of genuine fear that they're willing to overcome once they're equipped, and which church leaders are just always going to be too scared no matter what you do. And I think there'll always be a mix of both in churches, but we're hoping that over time, once people are equipped, they'll be able to speak out more, and that a lot of them will be willing to do so.
I'm wondering, is it a cultural issue? Because I remember visiting a church in Houston, and in the middle of the sermon, they talked about actually the importance of life. I remember watching sermons in other very large churches in the US and taking a break and saying, I need to raise this issue, that life is important. Life in the womb is important. God has made that life. And you kind of have a understanding of the importance of life that actually, you're right, in few UK churches you come across. In my own church in KT, the former pastor made an apology on the church on Sunday because what was the name? A Church of England canon, J. John actually was going through the 10 Commandments and talked about murder. And then in the middle of that, he took a sidestep and said, actually, I need to point out that actually taking the life of the unborn is murder. And for 2 minutes, he talked about it. And then he said, there's forgiveness of the cross. I want to pray for anyone who's been affected by this issue, and then moved on. And on the Sunday, the then leader of the church made a public apology in case anyone was offended. And you've got offense and you've got murder. I'll go with actually trying to stop the murder as opposed to the offense. But we seem to fall into that worry about how people think. And is it a cultural issue, a transatlantic issue?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, there are some great church leaders in the UK. I'm not saying every church leader is bad at this. So J. John is a fantastic example of someone who's been willing to speak about this. Vaughan Roberts from St. Ebbs in Oxford is another example. And there are others, so they're not the only ones. And we're very grateful for church leaders like that. I think I'd say that even among the church leaders that are sort of scared, I think there are two reasons for that. One of them is a sort of legitimate worry that I think is misplaced, but nevertheless legitimate. And then one of them is not at all. So the legitimate one is people who are genuinely fearful that if they speak about this sort of issue, they will put people off who are not Christians. And therefore, they will not be open enough even to becoming a Christian. And of course, Christianity is even more important than the issue of abortion, if we can frame it in that way. And so they have this worry that, well, if someone just is turned off coming to my church or listening to anything we say because of this issue, they're not going to become a Christian. They're not going to believe anything that we believe in the end. And so they're worried about the most important thing. Again, I think that's misplaced, but I think it's an understandable worry. And then others are not worried about the sort of evangelistic impact. They're just worried about, as you say, causing offense, which, you know, the Bible doesn't teach us to go out and cause offense deliberately, but it does tell us to go and speak the truth. And if the truth offends, then so be it. And so, you know, as I said, there are ways to speak about this issue that are winsome and compassionate and full of grace. There are certainly ways of speaking about it that are not full of those things and that are genuinely bad. But I think if a church leader is unwilling to even speak about it in a good way, in a winsome, compassionate way, then I think there's a real problem. I would say the US doesn't have as much of an issue, but there's still an issue. A lot of pastors there won't speak about it. There's a lot of confusion. And then even around the world, you know, we might expect that in most of the world, church leaders would be much more conservative and outspoken. And again, even then, it's a big mix. I would say that, for example, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the church leaders are very vocal about this and very clear and forthright, and there's no issue with, you know, fear or anything like that. In parts of the Caribbean, and again, not saying it's true of everywhere in the Caribbean, but in a lot of the Caribbean, from speaking with friends there, you know, even there where abortion is mostly illegal, where most people are Christians, generally traditional culture, even there's often a massive fear among church leaders about speaking about this issue. And so I would say even across the world, it's a mixed bag, even in those places that are traditionally much more conservative cultures.
Okay, let's look at legislation. What is the current? Every country will be different. The UK has certainly been pushing this all the way up to birth in terms of whatever issues you want to bring in, and therefore it's up to birth. Where if you look at the further east you go in Europe, you've got more restrictions on abortion. We've got the buffer zones. Do you want to just update the viewers and listeners on what is the current situation in the UK in terms of abortion?
Yeah, so in the UK, we have a law that in practice allows abortion for any reason up to 24 weeks or 6 months, which again, you know, by this point, the baby is pretty much fully developed. They're viable from about 21 to 22 weeks. They could survive outside the womb even by this point without their mother. The baby's able to feel pain. The baby has a heartbeat, brain waves. They can taste food, all sorts of things. They're very much developed. And the UK allows that up to 6 months. If the baby has a disability, and in theory in the law, it says if there's a serious handicap and it was intended to be, you know, life-limiting conditions where the baby can only survive a few days, for example, in practice, basically any disability, it justifies abortion up until birth at any point in pregnancy. And we do know that there are abortions for things like Down syndrome in the 8th or even sometimes the 9th month in the UK. So if you compare, well, the last thing to say about the UK is technically abortion is not legal for any reason up to 6 months. In the law, it actually says it's legal to protect the physical or mental health of the woman. And again, that was intended to be quite strict. You know, it took 2 doctors to genuinely decide in good faith that keeping the baby would genuinely cause a significant mental or physical health risk. But in practice, you go to the doctor. Often you don't even see the doctor. You see a nurse or someone else and you say, I don't want a baby. They say, do you feel like it would cause you some emotional difficulty? You say yes. And therefore they say, well, then it counts as mental health and you can have an abortion. And so in theory, we only have abortion for health reasons and for disability in the UK. But in practice, it's for any reason up until about 6 months. So this is much, much more extreme than most of Europe. Most of Europe only allows abortion up to 12 weeks, if it allows it at all. And that includes countries, probably going to misremember. So I think Germany sets a 12-week limit. I think some of the Scandinavian countries even have 12-week limits, like Norway and Denmark. Sweden is 18 weeks, and that's, you know, everyone knows that Sweden is sort of the most extreme progressive country in the world. Even they have a limit at 18 weeks, and we're a month and a half beyond that. And so we're definitely an outlier, not only globally, but even within Western Europe, we're far, far more extreme. And so that's why 70% of women, over 70% of women in the UK think that the law should be stricter than it actually is, because I think there's a broad recognition within this country, even with a 95% pro-choice population, still most people realize that our law is just way too extreme and think that it needs to be tightened up.
I mean, is there any, does the law state when life begins? Because that's what it boils down to. And in the UK, you talk to, let's say you talk to liberals, and I've had conversation with family members, and they seem to think the birth canal gives some magical properties of life. At the second it goes through that point, that they, well, it's alive, but 20 seconds before it's not alive. I think that's not really a scientific definition of when life is. Position is not about life. Actually, it has to be more than that. But so in the UK, is there any definition of actually when life begins? Because that's seemingly what it boils down to.
Yeah, not really. I mean, in terms of when a child is fully protected, it would be when birth is complete. And so there's actually been a bit of legal debate about partial birth abortion. This is where the baby is half delivered. So you deliver the legs, the body, and then the head is still just inside the birth canal, and you perform an abortion at that stage of pregnancy. It's absolutely barbaric and grotesque, but it seems to be legal in the UK. So even halfway through delivery, it seems to be the case that abortion can still be performed, and so the baby is not a full legal person that's protected at that point. There is the law does actually sort of define pregnancies beginning in two different ways. So when you measure the time limit for abortion, it says up to 24 weeks. That is actually measured from the last period of the woman, which is 2 weeks before conception. And so in that sense, it doesn't define it as conception. It says pregnancy begins 2 weeks before conception at the last period. But when they're defining what abortion is and what versus contraception, what's the difference between contraception and abortion? Well, at that point, they define pregnancy as beginning at implantation, which is a week or two after conception. And the reason for that is, if there are forms of contraception that act after fertilization, so they technically cause very early abortions, that makes doctors and contraceptive manufacturers very unhappy, because it means they're much more regulated, and therefore they prefer to class all of these drugs as contraceptives because the law is less strict about contraceptives. And so the UK law defines a legal person only when birth is fully completed. And it defines pregnancy in two different ways, either from the last period or from implantation, neither of which is conception, which is the scientifically accurate beginning of life. And so the law in the UK is a total mess. It's totally contradictory and inconsistent. And all I can say is, the law might not define it clearly, but if I was asked in my medical school exams, when does a human organism begin? There's only one answer that would be remotely acceptable, and that would be fertilization. That's the scientifically obvious answer.
I mean, because obviously, as someone who's never gone through the medical field, I went through aerospace, so very different. But in the medical field, how is it that someone can go through that and you decide to be a doctor? Because one, you've got the ability, the intellectual ability, but two, because you want to actually do good, you want to help, that's what you want to do in your career. And I kind of scratch my head thinking of someone who decides they want to be a doctor. What do you want to do? Well, I like to kill babies. I mean, is that on kind of the options list of what you take? I mean, how does it move from someone getting in that field to actually that being a profession? Let me kill babies, and that's what I've signed up for. It, as someone in the non-medical profession, it's quite confusing.
Yeah, I think part of the answer is that I think doctors themselves and some of the public have unreasonably inflated view of doctors. A lot of doctors do a lot of what they do for goodwill and get into it for good intentions, but it's also a highly prestigious career that earns a decent salary. That, there are many reasons why people want to be a doctor other than because it helps people. And to be honest, if you really want to help people, there are much more effective things you can do. You could go into banking, earn a lot of money, and then donate it all. That would actually have an impact hundreds or thousands of times bigger than being a doctor. And so that's not to say all doctors are just in it for the money and the prestige, but there's a lot of that, and there's certainly a lot of pride in the medical profession. And so I don't think we should just have this view that doctors are just saintly people. They might be better than average morally, but that's not saying much. And certainly not all of them are better than average. In terms of the ones who might get into it for sort of reasons of goodwill and good intentions, I think it's best reflected by, there's a paper on second trimester abortion by, what's her name? Lisa, I've forgotten her surname, I'm afraid. Lisa Harris, I think it is. And she writes a paper on second trimester abortion, and she says, we need to stop being dishonest about this. This is, in some ways, a horrendous procedure. And she describes it. She talks about, for example, when she was doing an abortion and she pulled the legs off the baby, and at the same time, she felt her own baby kicking inside of her because she was pregnant while she was doing this abortion. And she said, like, tears were flowing down her face and this sort of thing. Like, it was a very visceral experience. And so she's, in that sense, quite open and honest about what abortion involves. And she even says explicitly in that article, abortion is violence. She doesn't hold back. She says abortion is clearly violence, but she says it's an even greater violence to force women to stay pregnant against their will. And so I don't know if every abortion practitioner thinks of it that way. Probably not. Probably many of them are in total denial and just try to sort of deny the fact that they're doing anything violent. They're probably just trying to treat it as no big deal. But when you get an honest doctor that really knows what they're doing and still does it, I think that has to be something like the justification, that they think, yes, of course, this is violence and it's horrible, but it's even worse to force a woman to stay pregnant, and therefore it's the lesser of two evils. So that's how some people would think of it, at least.
I want to get your kind of view on the pro-life movement in the UK. You've been very heavily involved in campaigning for that, being a high-profile activist, and you emceed the March for Life event a couple of months ago in London. And I'm embarrassed to say that was the first one I attended, and I attended the seminars in the morning and then went for the march in the afternoon to Parliament Square. But 10 years of that, do you want to give us an insight? I mean, half of our viewers are US viewers. I think it'd be good for them to also understand what the situation is in the UK, what your experiences have been being involved in the pro-life movement, trying to win the public over, win public support, win political support, engaging in the media. Give us an insight into what that journey has been like.
Yeah, so I certainly wasn't there from the beginning of March for Life. I've been, how many times? Maybe 3 or 4 times now to the UK March, a few times in other countries. I'm told that it began very small. I think it began with just a couple of dozen people in Birmingham about 10 years ago, and then really incredibly has expanded to thousands and thousands there now in London. I know other countries, they do it a bit differently. They do hundreds of marches across the country. So every country does it a bit differently. We have a big one in London each year. And it's been incredible to see how that's grown over the years and how many young people are involved. It's not just sort of a fading generation that's, gradually losing momentum and losing ground. If you go to the march, it's absolutely full of young people, and I think growing each year. And so, yeah, that's been hugely encouraging. And I think it's interesting because what the abortion lobby is trying to do is to say that this is a settled issue, it's a decided issue, and that there's no room for debate. And they could probably get away with that for many years because there wasn't really much pushback for a good long time. And now I think we're at the point where sort of teenage and young people's rebelliousness is actually getting, the new conservatism is actually being pro-choice. That's the thing we've had in this country for 50 or 60 years. And people who want to sort of grow up questioning things and going against the establishment are increasingly recognizing that the establishment and the older generations are pro-abortion, and that they're trying to sort of maintain that at all costs. And so I think there is an increasing generation of young people that are beginning to ask questions, and naturally the establishment's getting very nervous about that and trying to shut it down and pretend there's nothing to debate. And so yeah, I'm excited about what the next few years might show. There's some polling, and I don't know, it's a little bit mixed, but there is some evidence that the youngest people in the UK are the most pro-life. That's not to say the majority are pro-life. It's still tough being a pro-life person at university, but it does seem to be that the youngest generation is more pro-life than any other. And so our hope is that this will build over the next few years, and hopefully we'll be able to have even more significant conversations about what is really good for women, what is really good for children, what is really good for society, especially as we see the costs of not having any kids, the economic costs and other things. We're gradually seeing that that's going to cause huge economic problems. I don't know if anyone in my generation is actually convinced they're going to get a pension when they're in their 60s or 70s. I'm certainly not. And that's because we don't have enough kids. And so I think as those problems increase and get worse, and the economic reality of that hits home, I think a lot of people will be wondering, did we make some mistakes when it came to suppressing childbearing and breaking up families and encouraging people not to have them?
I mean, is it and I was really pleasantly surprised by the amount of certainly younger people at not only the event in the beginning of the day, but in the march. And you realize there is hope when you see that, a different generation actually standing up and for life. But I mean, every generation faces its own issues. And in this generation, it's an issue of, it's about me. It's about putting off having children later in life, putting off commitment, actually zero commitment, kind of do you want. And that different, I guess, focus on life, more the individual as opposed to the collective, much less responsibility towards society and much more on I can do what I want and screw the world type of thing. That is a difficult concept to bring into this, which is about thinking of others. So how do you kind of marry that, this maybe a more selfish attitude to this issue, which has to be selfless because you're thinking of someone else?
It's tough. And, there are arguments that abortion is bad, even if you're self-interested. The mental health evidence is quite clear that if a woman has an abortion, she's more likely to be anxious, more likely to be suicidal, more likely to do drugs and alcohol and all sorts of things. And so even from a selfish perspective, abortion is bad for women and people making that decision. And so on the other hand, those arguments haven't persuaded so far. And maybe that's because the establishment sort of denies that evidence, or maybe it's because people just aren't motivated in that moment by theoretical knowledge of what their mental health might be like in future. It's more of a panic decision. It's more of a, freaking out, my life's going to be over as I know it, and I just have to get rid of this and change this situation. And I'm not thinking about, potential mental health outcomes 20 years down the line. And so I don't know which of those is the reason that those arguments haven't persuaded. But for that reason, it's always going to be a challenge in a culture that is primarily about the individual and about doing what you desire and what you want and forgetting about your responsibility to others and the need to care for others. I think it will always be challenging to get rid of abortion in that context. And so we don't really know how to solve it in that sense. We're hoping that people will wake up. And of course, there is a significant sentiment of helping others, and some people call it social justice, some people call it something else, but this sense of societal responsibility among young people. It's not like it's completely dead. They'll be very selfish in some respects, and then the next week they'll spend all of their time at a protest for something that helps society, or they think helps society in some way. And so some of that, I'm sure, is grandstanding. I'm sure some of it is virtue signaling, but I think a lot of it is genuine sympathy. I think when people, spend their Saturday going to march for Palestine, whatever you think of that issue, whoever you think is in the right, I think a lot of the young people in those marches genuinely think that there are people suffering, and it's my responsibility, and I have to spend some of my valuable time going out to speak for them. And so in that sense, the sort of societal duty and that sense of duty is not gone. It's just very selectively targeted nowadays. There's not a general sense of, with everyone around me, with my family, with my neighbors, with my society, every decision I make has to be something that contributes to them and their flourishing. It's more like, okay, in most areas, it's all about me and I should do what makes me happy and follow my heart. But then there are some things where it's just so bad that I have to, give a bit of my time to that. I think it's just much more targeted in that way, rather than just a complete sense of, irresponsibility. And so the question is, how can we channel those remaining desires to do good, and to show that they apply to all of society and all of life, and not just a few kind of select issues. And I think once we are able to build that sort of virtue and responsibility in a more global sense, then we might be in a better position to fix this issue as well.
How do you look in this from a campaigning point of view? Because there are many angles you could take and where you focus on. Do you look at the media and push the message on that? Do you focus on MPs, on the political sphere? Do you look at the church and actually engaging on that? There are many aspects you could look at actually using that for influence. So how do you see kind of the movement or the breakthrough or the focus for you personally?
Yeah, I think it's always going to be a mix of those. I think any societal movement requires getting all the different sectors on board. And even if you look at, people pushing the other way, even when it seems hopeless, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where almost everyone is pro-life, the abortion industry globally will still target politicians, they'll target doctors, they'll target the media, and they'll even target church leaders. Even though they know that almost all the church leaders are against them, they will try and get church leaders to get on board with them, just so that they can say this is not an issue where if you're Christian, you're pro-life, or you're Muslim, you're pro-life. You can be a Christian or Muslim and still support abortion, and therefore try to shift the population that way. And so I would say it involves all of them. But I think the thing that has struck me about, I guess, a public opinion on abortion and how pro-life movements have succeeded around the world is very, very difficult for a pro-life movement to succeed without having, at the very least, a core base of enthusiastic supporters among Christians or Muslims. I think that's just the reality. You look at the US pro-life movement. Yes, 25% of atheists in America are pro-life, according to polls, and that's significant. That's a lot of people who are totally non-religious and they're pro-life. But when you look at people who are actively engaged in pro-life campaigning or volunteering at a pregnancy help center or whatever it might be, the overwhelming majority of them, about 99% of them, are Christian. And there are some exceptions, obviously. That's why it's only 99%. I have some great atheistic friends who do, Monica Snyder, who runs Secular Pro-Life, does a fantastic job. Everyone's convinced she's secretly a Christian, and I can tell you from knowing her, it's far from the case. So there are great people like that, but the reality is that 99% of pro-life people who are actually doing something in the US are Christians. And therefore, it's very, very difficult to even make a start unless you have a core group of Christians who are willing to do something. And so, we can still affect the politics. At the moment in the UK, they're trying to legalize abortion up until birth. And even without the church being engaged, some of our groups working in the politics have been able to stop that. And so I'm not saying we should just forget everything until we have the church on board, because we can do a lot even without them. But I think in order to make really significant change long term, I think the place to start has to be the church, because that's where people are going to get involved and get motivated and actually do something.
Oh, completely. I'm always curious in why, looking at the different aspects of the transatlantic issue, how they engage in this in the US and engage in this in the UK, and I've been I've been accused by different CAV vicars of, you're one of them, you're one of those Americans, you spread hate against the women who are coming in. No, I'd just like to maybe offer a different solution or even pray. And in the UK, we've got a horrendous situation where silent prayer is now illegal in many areas in the UK, including, probably I could walk to the first place that was instituted, probably take me 30 minutes to walk. And sadly, my MP has been one of the most vocal on making sure that we can criminalize anyone who may dare pray around an abortion clinic. How in the UK have we got to the position, to the state, where actually praying to God in certain areas in the UK is illegal? Silent prayer.
It is remarkable. I should say, the good news is that if a C of E vicar is saying it, then it's probably not true. So you're probably doing a decent job. I think this is an area that kind of always fascinates me, because I hear a lot of Christians in the UK saying, look at these Americans, they don't actually do anything to help women or whatever. And you actually look at the numbers in the American pro-life movement, and the overwhelming majority of the American pro-life movement is practical pregnancy centers supporting women. It's probably like 90% of the pro-life resources in the US. There are 3,000 of those centers. On average, they have about 28 volunteers and 5 full-time paid staff. And of course, all of those salaries are coming almost entirely from charity as well, from private giving. And so you look at the American pro-life movement and what the American church is doing, and it's overwhelmingly supporting women practically. And then you ask those same Christians in the UK that are criticizing the Americans for being hateful and political and so on, you ask them what they're doing for women in crisis pregnancies, and the answer is almost always absolutely nothing. And so it's an astonishing, I guess just a narrative. It's just a false narrative that the media has spread about the American pro-lifers. And sadly, even many Christians in the UK have just adopted this without actually becoming educated about the facts, or even just getting to know anyone in America who's involved in this. And so I think part of our job is just educating about, firstly, what the American pro-life movement is like, secondly, about how churches can get engaged here to be able to do something similar, and just showing that we're not crazy, fanatical sort of hate preachers, but we actually do just want to protect women and children. That's all it's about. So yeah, we're obviously in a very difficult position in the UK with these censorship zones. I'm told that I think the guidance is just being released, that it might not actually necessarily be illegal to silently pray, which doesn't sound like much of a consolation. It's not necessarily illegal to pray silently. But you know, and that's I'm sure because of some of the great campaigning work that's been done on this issue by many organizations. And so, you know, there's still room for fighting on this issue. We don't know where the boundaries of the law are. It's obviously a complete farce. You know, there are so many basic civil liberties that are being violated here, not just freedom of religion, but freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, in some cases freedom of speech, in some cases freedom of assembly. And what's crazy is that when you look at the way this law was introduced, with the bill about protest in general, all of the kind of far left groups and progressive groups said this bill is absolutely draconian. It limits all of these civil liberties. The government is absolutely authoritarian, and so on. And the form of protest or assembly that was most limited was outside of abortion clinics, and they actually supported it. So it was just a case of not just hypocrisy, but also in reacting to the whole bill that way, they were actually conceding that, yes, this is absolutely draconian and crazy and a gross violation of civil liberties. The government even admitted this. They said, we think that this section of the bill does violate the Convention on Human Rights or the Human Rights Act. It wasn't put there by the government. It was put there by a Labour amendment and then got enough votes. And so they said, we actually think this violates human rights and so on, but we still support the bill as a whole. And so everyone agreed that some part of this bill violated human rights. The government said that the abortion part violated human rights. The left said that the whole bill violated human rights. So there should have been an overwhelming consensus that this particularly draconian part of the bill was, just absolutely crazy and authoritarian. But sadly, that's the part that's somehow managed to gain the most support because of, I think ultimately because it's not liberal democracy that most of these people care about. It's it's preserving their civil liberties rather than preserving everyone's. And so that's, I think, unfortunately how we've got here, because we've lost the ability to understand politics in a genuinely liberal sense. It's only about putting forward your own point of view. It's only about protecting your own liberties or the liberties of certain special interest groups. There are very, very few people nowadays who understand the need for civil liberties and why they have to apply to everyone, even if you don't agree with them. And so I think it's really just a failure in civics and a failure in education about what liberalism actually is that's led us to this point.
Oh yeah, and part of this slide is moving towards assisted suicide, so which is very much part of the conversation in the UK. So you've got abortion, which has been there since, was it 67 or 67 Act, and now they're looking at end of life, and there seems to be that this is a full-on attack on life, that if you're young, you don't have value. If you're old, you don't have value. And they talk about putting protections, but we've seen, as in Belgium, that actually, you're a teenager and you feel a bit down that day. Hey, would you like to end your life? Or Canada, as that's proposed. And whatever safeguards our politicians seem to talk about, it's not going to be there. When the bill is in place, then there'll be loopholes found. So we seem to be in a massive push in the UK towards actually just ending life. And we see that through the assisted suicide bill, which is being debated and pushed through Parliament at the moment.
I think so. And yeah, we've, maybe 30 years ago when I think Netherlands was the only country or one of the only countries that allowed it. I think, maybe you could have got away with saying that, the Netherlands has done it badly. They've had a slippery slope, but we can do it better. We can put in real safeguards and have a much stricter law that's much better regulated. And when I hear people say that now, after seeing the Netherlands, Canada, Belgium, Oregon, and all these other countries, honestly, all I can do is laugh. I think, I don't think anyone at this point seriously believes in their heart that you can put in significant safeguards to euthanasia and prevent the slippery slope. I think if you do believe that, you're completely delusional and you know absolutely nothing about how this goes every single time in every other country that it happens. 30 years ago, you could get away with that sort of naivety. I think if you have that sort of naivety today, you shouldn't be in politics. You shouldn't be speaking about politics. And so, yeah, I think it's clearly very, very dangerous. I've been a little bit encouraged. I'm really encouraged by politics in the UK. But in this case, I think, I've been pleasantly surprised at how in Parliament, there's been a genuine debate. It's not just a case of one special interest group getting their way. It's not just a case of Labour or Conservatives following their lobbyists or whatever. We've seen significant people in the Labour government that would be expected to legalize euthanasia actually opposing it. We have a Labour health minister, a Labour health secretary, a Labour justice secretary, who have both come out in opposition to it, apparently to the great concern of the Prime Minister even. And that's been hugely encouraging that, these very, very far left progressive politicians who absolutely everyone would expect to just go for euthanasia have not only stayed silent or abstained, but have actually come out vocally in opposition to it. And of course, that means that there's actually a real chance of us succeeding. And if we can succeed with a Labour supermajority, and even in that situation, if we can protect life, then I think that will set a really significant and important precedent for hopefully many years to come, that we've just decided and convinced enough of society that this is just genuinely a very bad idea, regardless of your ideology. And hopefully that can be more resistant to these continual attempts every couple of years to reinvigorate the issue.
No, absolutely. Can I one last point to squeeze in, just to find and end with the industry. Kind of looking into Planned Parenthood, in the US, seems to be a well-funded organization, and it seems to be not only ideology but actually making money through the murder of children. In the UK, I mean, BPAS and it's part of the NHS. It's not private, and therefore it doesn't seem to have the same ability to make money. So it seems to be more ideological. Maybe just end off on that, because they're very different pushes towards abortion. And I for me, actually, it does seem as though in the US it is a money-making scheme, where in the UK it doesn't seem to have that ability. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it certainly can make huge amounts of money anywhere, and I think that seems to be the trend. I mean, globally there are tens of millions of abortions a year, so that's a huge market for, in many cases, an expensive medical procedure, and so there's a huge amount of money that can be made from this. And of course, it's tied to other money-making things, which are often even bigger, like contraception and sort of plugging that and promoting that for teenage girls and everything. So I'd say it's all part of one industry, I guess the global sex industry, and it's connected with pornography, with prostitution, with contraception, with sexually transmitted diseases, with abortion. All of it goes together. And because sex is a big part of life, most people at some point in their lives has sex. Many people have a lot of sex, and therefore there's a huge amount of money to be made from it. And so this inevitably, even if some of the activists aren't doing it for financial reasons, I think it's inevitable that it will be hijacked by industries and corporations with, strong financial interests in, being involved in it in some way. And so absolutely, it's a big part in the UK, it's a big part in the US. And one of the most significant things is the move from surgical abortion, where you have to see doctors in person and then have the abortion in person and have it performed by trained professionals. What they're now doing is basically you call up the abortion clinic, don't even have to speak to a doctor. You answer a few set questions. I imagine they'll probably do it with AI before too long. And then you get sent the pills, and that's it. And it's far, far cheaper. You don't even have to have a physical building in the end. And I don't know if they're still being paid the same amount per abortion, but it wouldn't surprise me. I'm sure they're still being paid a lot per abortion. And of course, the cost is much, much cheaper as a result. And so what we see above all in the abortion industry is a desire to cut costs. And we can see that not necessarily by what they say, but by what they do. What they do is very clearly intended to just cut costs dramatically. And, I'd be very surprised if they were just as happy for their income to be cut just as dramatically. And so, yeah, I don't think money motivates everyone pushing for abortion, but that's not the point. We're not claiming that everyone who supports it is just interested financially. We're saying that once it becomes normalized and legalized and a big part of society, it will be hijacked by the groups who do want to make a lot of money from it. Groups like MSI, Marie Stopes International, groups like BPAS and others, and they are making a lot of money. And so you can see how much their CEOs get paid. I think Marie Stopes gets paid $200,000 a year with a $200,000 bonus. I think he's one of the highest paid charity and CEOs in the UK. And so, yeah. It's not about money for everyone, but there is a lot of money, and it is about money for a lot of very powerful people.
Well, Calum Miller, I appreciate your time today on this huge topic, which is not a contentious topic at all. It's a simply common sense of life, and standing up for the voiceless. And I have huge respect for what you do in championing the case of the unborn and speaking up for them when often we find that many in the media and the political realm don't speak. So thank you for joining us and giving us an update on what the situation is in the UK and your work. So thank you, Calum.
Thank you. And yeah, just thanks to your listeners. I just say get involved. Don't just sit there being pro-life, but go to, especially the March for Life is such an easy thing to go to. It's usually every September. So it's a while till the next one, but put it in your diary, plan to go to that in London, and maybe get involved with some of the other pro-life groups. There are many around. I'm sure you can find them easily on Facebook or Google or whatever. So don't just be pro-life, but find some way to get involved and support this cause, and you won't regret it.
And if you follow Calum on X on Twitter, you'll know when the next one is and any other events, and we will certainly promote the next one next year. So Calum, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Take care.